Here we are at the border of North Carolina and Georgia. You can see behind me the Welcome to North Carolina sign. You can also see a sign that says that masks are required in North Carolina. That's a difference in policy between the two states. Today we're going to talk about internal boundaries. I'm Mr. Coulter and this is Human Geography. Today we're going to get into internal boundaries, which is 4.6 in our Unit 4 study of political geography. So we need to first understand the difference between international boundaries and internal boundaries. International boundaries are the ones we've talked about a lot more frequently recently, where we focus on the borders between two different states. So like the US border with Canada is an example of an international boundary. Most of the borders that we talked about yesterday were international boundaries. But internal boundaries are subdivisions within a state. So these are borders between provinces or states like Georgia or Florida. So if we look at the map of the United States, we can see we're divided up into 50 different states, and those are all internal boundaries because they're a part of the larger state of the United States. So let's look at some of those subdivisions. There aren't just the one type that fits all for these internal boundaries. It's not like states or provinces are the only ones. So we're going to look at a bunch of different types to give you an idea of all the different sub-state divisions we can find. So the first one is what we were just talking about, which is the states within the United States, like Georgia and Alabama. This is the Welcome to Georgia sign as you're coming from South Carolina. And they said, we're glad Georgia's on your mind as you cross the border. These are the provinces of Canada. You can see that they are different provinces and territory, but since they are further subdivisions of the country / when we call it state of Canada, these are all the different internal boundaries. But internal boundaries can go smaller than the state level. We see here, these are the congressional districts, which we'll talk about a lot today. We are broken up into 435 voting districts in the United States. And you can see the population of each spread out around this. So these are all the different congressional districts as of 2017. And then this map right here is the county map of Georgia. You can see Fulton County right there, and we are right at the top of it where Cambridge High School is. So these are counties, those are internal boundaries. City boundaries are also internal boundaries. This is when you're driving into the city of Milton, the establishment of that boundary. And you can even go as small as high school zones would be a different type of internal boundary. So this is before Cambridge High School even was created, when it was just called Bethany and Cogburn High School site. That top purple area was what was going to be Cambridge High School. So the internal boundaries of school zones would count as well. And there's a lot of reasons why we look at internal boundaries, but one of the biggest ones is voting. And when we get into political geography, it's important that we understand the way that we vote in the United States. So in the US, we're divided up into 435 voting districts. In those voting districts, each one elects its own representative to the House of Representatives in Congress. So each district selects a representative, which means that there are 435 representatives in Congress. Each of those districts is supposed to have relatively equal population, which in 2010 was 710,000 people. So each of those districts has about 710,000 people in them. And representatives are elected every 2 years on even-numbered years. So we had the 2020 election, and then they'll be re-elected in 2022. Georgia's districts for congressional representation, you can see that our school is in District 6 right there, next to where it says Roswell. That is District 6, but there are 14 voting districts in the state of Georgia. And that takes us to redistricting. So redistricting is what happens after the census. Every 10 years, the United States holds a census that counts how many people live in each state. So the census was last year in 2020. And the census counts how many people live in each state. After the census, Congress looks at each state and they decide if they need to add districts or take away districts from different states. So they reapportion the different districts to different states. Reapportionment is this time when they are changing the number of districts in each state. So sometimes your state loses them. We'll see Georgia's grown a lot if we gain a district. And then once they have the number of seats, they will redraw the district lines, and that's called redistricting. So you redraw the district lines, and that's done at the state level. So reapportionment's done at the national level where they make that decision, and then at the state level, you redistrict your own state. In most states, the party in power in the House, like in that state, or the governor, is in charge of redrawing those lines. Some states have a bipartisan committee. That means it's not a political party that makes those choices. But in the majority of states, a political party decides how are they going to redraw these district lines. And sometimes they do that to their advantage, which takes us to a term called gerrymandering. You may have heard the strange term gerrymandering before, but gerrymandering is the redrawing of voting districts in a way that will give one party maximum political advantage. So the party in charge redraws the lines in order to try to maximize their advantage. It was named after a governor in the 1800s named Elbridge Gerry. Fun fact, he actually went on to become vice president. But he was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812. And because he drew a district that looked so strange, people compared it to a salamander. You can see this was the original political cartoon. Because his last name was Gerry, they called it gerrymandering for the salamander. So he will forever have his name tied to this practice. It was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, but now they have certain rules they have to follow in order to do gerrymandering, but it still happens. There are two main ways that you can gerrymander. The first one is called packing. That's where you understand that you're going to lose some districts, so you try to pack as many of your opponent's voters into a small district and put them all in one district. So you try to limit the number of seats they get by putting as many as possible into one district. Cracking is when you try to split up your opponent's voters so their vote is diluted. So that would be like splitting your opponents up over 3 different districts so that you win all 3 of those districts because they're a minority in each of the districts. So packing and cracking are the 2 types of gerrymandering. And to be clear, both parties do this. Again, that's the original graphic of the salamander. So instead of trying to blame one party, since both parties are responsible for doing this, I'm going to use yellow and green so we don't have any controversy there. So let's look at this district where people live. Let's say these are all neighborhoods, each of the squares, and they're neighborhoods that are represented by their political party. 40% of those neighborhoods are green, and 60% of those neighborhoods are yellow. So it would make sense that you would split them up into 5 equal districts, because the Supreme Court ruled they have to be equal population districts, and then there would be 10 of these neighborhoods in each district. So if we look at this top left one right here, so let's say the yellow party is in power, and they draw the line across that way. That gives them the advantage in every district, which would mean even though 40% of the people voted for green, still all 5 districts would be represented by the yellow politician. But then if we look at this one, where green draws the lines, green may draw it so they pack all of yellow's voters into those 2 thin districts on that side, and then they take 3 representatives. So they would have the majority despite only getting 40% of the vote. So both those are examples of gerrymandering where you draw the lines. If we look at the bottom and you proportionately make sure that people get the right amount of districts, then that means that you would have 5 completely represented districts. 3 would go to yellow and 2 would go to green. But this one is more of what we would see if you had even amount districts where you had some diversity of voting in the district. And that is where yellow would still get 3, green would still get 2, and they would be represented proportionally. So that's gerrymandering, where you try to either pack as many of the opponent's voters into one district, or you try to spread them out so they're diluted amongst many districts. So I'm going to use the example of Alabama because it's one that I'm familiar with since it's our neighbor state and that's where I went to college. Again, know that both parties do this, so this isn't, an attack on any one party. But the state of Alabama has a majority Republican vote. So there are 7 districts in the state of Alabama. And you can see that District 7 is the one Democratic district in the state of Alabama. And the way that it works is it hooks around Birmingham, goes all the way down and then scoops around the city of Montgomery, which is not very close to Birmingham, just gets the city of Montgomery, and then hooks all the way down towards Mobile and stops about three-fourths of the way to Mobile. That is just one district, and that's where the majority of the Democratic voters in Alabama live. So you can see that the lines are drawn to maximize the number of Republican districts. If we look at California, you can see the same thing where the Democrats have gerrymandered. So both parties do this, and its goal is to give them the political advantage in each thing. We're going to play a gerrymandering game about this in class. We learned today about the different types of internal boundaries that take place both in the world and in the United States, and we learned the voting importance of those internal boundaries. We also learned about gerrymandering, which is where you draw the political lines to best advantage your political party. We're going to continue learning about things that pull states together and push them apart as we go forward, in the way that sometimes states completely fail and break down and conflict arises because of it. This today about internal boundaries is one of our steps to better understand our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.